very much for coming to hear me talk today. My name's Sophie Medlins and I'm a lecturer in nutrition and dietetics at King's College in London. And I've come to present to you my research on nutrition and diet in people living with a stoma. I think it's really interesting, and I hope I can make it interesting to you guys too. It's a relatively under-researched area, as I'm sure you're all aware, and certainly the work that I'm doing is pretty innovative, which is amazing considering how different the dietary needs of people with stomas are, and yet we really haven't done very much research into this area at all. So the research that I've done so far is a mixed methods study, and it sort of spans a couple of years, really. So the summer is when I'm going to publish this research, but it is currently unpublished. So the first bit of research that we did was a 3-part E-survey, and as I'm sure you all know, the Ostomy community are so responsive. When we want research done, when we ask people to give us information about things, we get so many responses back, and that's amazing. The community really want help, especially in this dietary area, and yet the sort of resources don't exist at the moment to give them that help. So when we send out calls for people to complete surveys, we get great responses, so we thought we'd start with that. The second part of the study was looking at food-related quality of life. So questions like, do you have to get up from the table when you're having a meal to empty your stoma bag? Do you feel embarrassed when your stoma bag makes noise in public? Are there certain foods that you can't eat as a result of your stoma bag? Do you miss out on social occasions because of your stoma? These sorts of things. The third part was the really useful part, but also the more complicated part to fill in for the patients. So we used a model called EPIC, which we can understand about people's dietary intake. So it asks you questions like, how many times in the last 2 weeks have you eaten beef? How many times in the last 2 weeks have you eaten peanuts? And it literally goes through almost every food you can think of. So it takes a long time, but it gives us enough data so we can analyse people's diets and understand whether they're nutritionally adequate or not. We distributed the survey through social media, but we also were really lucky to be able to distribute it through people like Coloplast. So we're really lucky that Coloplast and Hollister and some of the other companies distributed the link to the e-survey through their email link outs, their email list of people, and that was super helpful. So anyone over the age of 16 with an intestinal or large bowel stoma, so jejunostomy, ileostomy, or colostomy, were eligible to take part. Yeah, great response. So for surveys, you're really lucky to get this kind of level of response. We had 260 completed responses for the quality of life part of the survey, and 226 people went on to complete the whole data set for us, which was amazing. 47.28 years was the average age of the person who filled in the survey, which is really good. And I was obviously with e-surveys, you're slightly concerned that you're missing out on that older demographic, but actually the age range was brilliant, so from 18 to 84. So we did still get a really good broad range of ages, particularly in that upper age category, which was really important. So, data heavy, but I'm going to talk you through it. So in terms of the demographics, the vast majority of people were from a white background. So I didn't necessarily get lots of answers on the things I was looking for, which I was mentioning before about whether South Asian people, for example, have different food-related quality of life. But we've got a reasonable number of people there. We had lots more people with a permanent stoma filling in the survey, which I think probably is indicative that those people are more engaged with trying to get help, whereas if you've got a temporary stoma, maybe there's a tendency to be bury your head in the sand a little bit and just manage it until it's gone. So most people had had their stoma for 7.5 years. On average, it was 7.5 years, but we did have a really nice range there, as you can see, from people having it formed in 1970 to people having it formed that year that we did this research. We asked people what they considered their current weight status to be. So do you consider yourself to be underweight, normal weight, or overweight? And as you can see, there's actually nearly half of the people, 94 people from the survey, were overweight. And lots of people found that they really struggled to manage their weight because of their stoma. And the other thing that we found out, and we'll talk about it a bit later on, is that actually lots of these people find that they can't follow normal healthy eating guidelines because of their stoma. The food-related quality of life data is presented here, so I'll talk you through this. This survey was validated on people with inflammatory bowel disease, so either ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. And it was validated by an incredible colleague of mine at King's called Miranda Loma. Now, these are normal people. This is the food-related quality of life of the average people in the population, the healthy population. So you can see their food-related quality of life is really high. On the left-hand side here, we've got people with IBD, so Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. And you can see that their food-related quality of life is worse than the healthy population. But people with a stoma, their food-related quality of life is much, much worse, even than these people with IBD. What we did using the data was develop a symptom severity score. And this wasn't validated. This was done through a statistician, but in a sort of, this is what we think we should do sort of a way. So it's not been validated properly in an academic sense. But we gave, so basically every person gave a score to each food. So what severity of symptoms does this food give you? So between 1 and 5. But they also sort of, if a food didn't give them any symptoms, then it didn't get a score. Does that make sense? So we gave a score for each food based on the number of people who had said it gives them symptoms, and then we times that by the severity of the symptoms. So the number of people who've given it a 5, then that food goes up much higher in terms of its symptom severity score. What we've got here is the top 12 foods in terms of symptom severity. And none of you will be at all surprised by the foods that are on this list. So the take-home message from this is, while our advice currently is anecdotal, we're getting it right. So the top food there is sweet corn, then peanuts and other nuts, mushrooms, apple with skin, baked beans, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, dried lentils, beans, peas, high-fibre breakfast cereal, beer, lager, cider, and dried fruit. So the top 12 foods, I reckon, if we all put in a poll, you all would have chosen those foods as being the ones that cause the problems. Any surprises there at all? No. So the next slide is kind of the next lot of 12 foods down. So we've got salad, onions, coleslaw, broccoli, cauliflower, fried fish and batter, which was an interesting one for me. I wasn't necessarily expecting that. What about you guys? Do you think that would be one of the top foods that people struggle with digestion-wise? I guess it's a very high-fat food. Low-calorie or diet fizzy drinks, I guess from a wind perspective, orange, mandarin, satsumas, peas, pure fruit juice and fizzy drinks. So again, lots of these foods we would predict in terms of people avoiding and people not managing very well. So the type of surgery that you've had, ileostomy, colostomy, people with an ileostomy had a higher symptom severity score than people with a colostomy. Again, pretty predictable stuff. We would probably expect that. It's relatively close. So when I was working in colorectal surgery, I always made sure I saw all the patients who just had an ileostomy. But if they were a colostomy and I didn't get to see them, I maybe wouldn't worry too much. But actually, it's almost the same. There's some disparity, but it's almost the same in terms of the numbers. So it's not necessarily predictive that people with an ileostomy need more dietary support than people with a colostomy. When we compared people's dietary intake to nutritional guidelines, so the ones that we used for this study, this is the Public Health England's Eat Well Guide. So unfortunately, when we were halfway through this research, they changed it slightly so that actually these foods here, which is like snack foods, crisps, biscuits, cakes, things like that, were taken out completely. So this is what is recommended, and this is what patients with stoma are eating in terms of dietary patterns. So you can see there that fruit and veg intake is much lower than what we would like it to be. Things like dairy, so in the blue there is dairy. They're eating a lot more dairy foods than is recommended, so higher fat foods there. Having a lot more fat in their diet than is recommended, a bit more protein. So from here, what I thought was really important was to understand from the patient's perspective. I wanted to speak to some patients, I wanted to get them in and talk to them about the dietary advice they'd received and really understand things a bit better from their perspective. So we had some focus groups, which was really nice, and we had a really nice broad range of patients. We had lots of patients who came from support groups, so headed up support groups in the local area. So obviously I'm based in London. But then we also had some patients in those same focus groups who hadn't felt that the support group had helped them at all. So we had some nice conflict there. So you know how some patients lead up a support group, their stoma function is great, they think everyone else's stoma function should be great, and they've got not very much time for people who say, actually, I'm really struggling. Some support groups are amazing, and some obviously have different characters within them. So we had a really nice broad range of people in those groups. I'm not going to go through all these questions, but I'll show you a few sort of quotes from our patients. So where do you go for dietary information? I wouldn't know where to go. really, like almost all of the people said, I have no idea where I'd go. Lots of people said they use support groups or they use Facebook or they use other people with a stoma to get this advice. But the majority of people said they wouldn't know where to go. This patient said, I didn't really get any advice. It was trial and error. I got a couple of blockages and then I tried to avoid things that I didn't digest. I think, again, that's really common, and we certainly give that advice that it is trial and error and give it a go and see how you get on. But anyone who's ever had a bowel obstruction, and thank God I haven't, but we all know how incredibly painful and debilitating that is for people, and no one wants to repeat that, so it can cause a lot of fear. We asked people how easy or difficult they find it to follow healthy eating guidelines and manage their weight. We had lots of really interesting quotes around this, including things like, when I leave my greens, when I'm eating with my friends, they say, oh, don't you like your vegetables? You should really eat your vegetables. And lots of things around stigma. So one of the other things that I do with a slightly different hat on is work talking about social media and the impact of nutrition in social media and how that impacts on people's body image and all that kind of stuff, and all these negative messages, not necessarily negative messages, but all these messages that are pushed out on social media all the time. So you know how there's this kind of clean eating wave of people pushing these messages all the time into people's faces. And lots of our patients were saying, I feel somehow inadequate, that I can't do that. I can't eat clean. There's something wrong with me. I feel this stigma around the way that I have to eat to manage my stoma. That's all of the research that we've done so far. I think one of the things that I feel really passionately about is that we're altering these people's digestion. We're doing an intervention on them, giving them a stoma. And then for a lot of these people, once they're sort of, certainly from a nutrition perspective, they're just sort of left. We just let them get on with it. And actually, we're putting them at massive risk of all kinds of long-term conditions and not managing that at all, and not giving them the opportunity necessarily to eat as healthy as everyone else can choose to. And of course, it's about choice. Of course, some people would never eat healthily even if they were given the option. Some people would have had a terrible diet before their stoma, and that's okay. But for those who want to concentrate on preventing diabetes, who want to think about preventing cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke, everything else, we're not really giving them the opportunity to do that. We're saying, here's all these foods that you're likely to struggle to eat, off you go.